For 34 years, I sat at the head of our table in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because my husband made sure no one would hear it. He wasn't cruel with fists or rage. No, Carl was too polished for that. He silenced me with polite corrections, interrupted stories, and the way he'd raise one eyebrow if I spoke too long. Our children learned early. Dad spoke, Mom nodded. I smiled through it, for the sake of peace, for the sake of family. And then, last fall, Carl suffered a stroke. Not a large one. He lived, he recovered. But he lost his voice, literally, permanently. And that Christmas, for the first time in decades, I carved the roast, lifted my glass, and began to speak. No one interrupted. No one looked away. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't lost my voice. I'd been saving it. I married Carl Whitmore when I was 23 years old, barefoot in my grandmother's garden, and in love with the way his confidence filled a room. He was 10 years older, already established, already admired. My mother called him a solid man, and my father, who rarely gave compliments, shook his hand and said, "You've done well, sweetheart." Carl was the kind of man who commanded attention, not by shouting, but by drawing every eye with his certainty. He was articulate, educated, and full of charm. And I, fresh from secretarial school, raised on modesty and manners, was taught to admire that kind of man. To defer, not challenge. To support, not speak over. In the early years, it felt like protection. Carl handled the bills, the decisions, the hard conversations. I stayed in the lanes I was raised to value: home, hospitality, and harmony. But, over time, I noticed a pattern. At dinner with his colleagues, he'd interrupt me mid-sentence. At holiday gatherings, if I began to share a memory or thought, he'd step in, finish it for me, or pivot the conversation before I could finish. It became so predictable, I stopped beginning. He never raised his voice, never insulted me outright. In public, Carl was a gentleman, but in private, I began to realize he had built a world where my silence served him best. I became the woman who made the pies, lit the candles, set the table, and then sat at the far end of it, smiling through mouthfuls of words that never got said. Our children grew up in that rhythm. They learned to look to their father for final answers. If I suggested something different, they'd glance at him, waiting for confirmation. I told myself it was fine, that Carl was strong, that I didn't need attention. I told myself that love sometimes looked like letting someone else lead. But love should never feel like erasure. Still, I stayed. Marriage, after all, is a long road, and I believed deeply in honoring the vows I made. Besides, Carl wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who had been told all his life that his voice mattered most. And I was the kind of woman who had never learned how to take up space without asking permission first. So I made peace with the silence. At least, I thought I had. That was until last November, Thanksgiving, when Carl didn't come down for coffee. When I found him in the hallway, clutching the wall with both hands, his face was pale and slacked on one side. The stroke was mild, thank God. His mind remained intact. He could still walk, still read, still live. But he lost his voice. The doctors called it aphasia, damage to the part of the brain that controls speech. His words came in fragments now, choppy, slow, difficult. He'd always spoken with ease. Now he sat at the head of the table with eyes full of thoughts he could no longer shape into sentences. And I, for the first time in my adult life, sat across from him, with every word I had ever swallowed rising like bread in a warm oven. In the weeks after Carl's stroke, the house felt quieter, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't empty. It was open. Carl sat in his recliner most days, a notebook at his side where he scribbled phrases and tried to reassemble the language that used to come so easily. I helped him, gently, without resentment. After all, he was still my husband, still the man I loved, Even if that love had worn grooves into me, I hadn't noticed until the silence began to echo. Our children visited often in those first few weeks. They brought casseroles, asked about therapy, and always spoke directly to me now. "How's Dad doing, Mom? Do you need anything?" They didn't seem to notice how they no longer looked to him for answers. Or maybe they did. Maybe it just felt natural, how quickly the balance shifted when one voice faded. I'd never spoken much during our family dinners. Over the years, I became the host, the background harmony. Carl always led the prayer, the conversation, the laughter. He liked a room arranged around his tone. I had convinced myself that was fine. But that Thanksgiving, just 2 weeks after the stroke, when the turkey had been carved and the wine poured, all eyes turned to Carl, out of habit. He opened his mouth, tried to begin a toast, but nothing came. A soft stammer, a garbled vowel. Then stillness. He looked at me, helpless, and I picked up his glass. "I think I'll say a few words," I said, my voice steady but unfamiliar, even to me. The room paused. I stood, held the glass just as Carl always had, and spoke about family, about gratitude, about the quiet strength it takes to carry things unseen. And no one interrupted. In the days following Thanksgiving, something shifted between Carl and me, not with force, but with weight. We went about our routines. I brought him tea. He pointed to words in his notebook. We played our parts. But underneath, something was unraveling. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. I had spoken, and the world hadn't collapsed. Carl had always worn authority like a tailored suit, measured, comfortable, unquestioned. But now he sat beside me at the table, silent. And I had begun to speak, not loudly, not excessively, but fully. And each word I shared seemed to draw a line between who I had been and who I was becoming. One evening, as we sat watching the fire crackle in the hearth, Carl tapped his pen against his notebook. Slowly he wrote, "You never used to speak that much." I read it, let the silence stretch. Then I said, "I was always speaking. You just never made space to hear me." He looked at me, really looked, and his mouth pressed into a line, his eyes not angry, but unsettled, because he knew I was. Right. That Sunday, our daughter Ellen stopped by with her youngest in tow. We sat in the living room, sipping tea, the child playing on the rug. Ellen asked about the church bake sale, and I found myself telling a story, an actual story, about the lemon cake I'd entered, how I accidentally used salt instead of sugar the first time around. She laughed, not out of politeness, but real delight, and Carl just listened. That evening after they left, Carl scribbled again. "I didn't know you were funny." I stared at the page. "I didn't forget," I said quietly. "I was just never given room to be remembered." He blinked. His jaw trembled. I wasn't trying to wound him, but I also wasn't trying to protect him from truths he helped bury. I had lost whole parts of myself in that house, not out of hatred or cruelty, but neglect. 1,000 small erasures. Jokes interrupted, opinions redirected, thoughts withheld because the space was never mine to begin with. But now, the silence was his, and I was learning how to live inside the sound of my own voice. It's a strange thing, rediscovering your own voice. At first, it comes with guilt, like you've taken something that wasn't meant for you. I found myself apologizing without realizing it, prefacing stories with, "This probably isn't important," or glancing at Carl as if asking for permission that no longer had to be granted. But slowly, something inside me settled. I stopped shrinking. I began sharing opinions at the dinner table, not just nodding in agreement, but offering my own. I told our grandchildren bedtime stories without checking if Carl had something to add. And when I laughed, really laughed, I didn't stifle it to keep the room polite. Carl watched all of it. Some days he seemed proud. Other days, something like regret flickered in his eyes. One afternoon, I came across an old journal while cleaning out the spare room. It was mine, dated back to 1986. Pages filled with thoughts. I hadn't spoken, ideas I'd written because I had nowhere else to place them. I read one entry aloud in the quiet of the kitchen. I wonder what it would be like to be the one people listen to first. Not because you're loud, but because you're heard. I closed the book and cried, not because I was sad, but because I wasn't that woman anymore. Carl sat across from me, flipping through the day's mail. I slid the journal over to him. He read the page slowly, then picked up his pen and wrote, "I wish I had read this 30 years ago." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "No," I said, "I wish I had read it to you." Because part of my silence was his doing, but part of it was mine, and I was finally ready to own both. That winter passed quietly, but not without warmth. I began taking morning walks again, something I hadn't done in years. I'd always told myself I didn't have time, but really, I'd just forgotten I was allowed to take it. I walked the neighborhood in thick scarves, waved at neighbors, and stopped to admire porch wreaths and frosted windows like they were museum pieces. Carl, though limited in speech, began to observe more. He'd sit by the front window with a blanket across his knees and watch me as I returned from my walks. I'd come in, cheeks pink, and he'd point to my scarf with raised eyebrows. "Yes," I'd smile. "I wore the red one today, the one you said made me look like a movie star." He'd nod, and for a moment, we weren't just two people. Recovering from distance, we were two people relearning each other. That February, Ellen hosted a small family dinner, nothing grand, just the kids, her brothers, their spouses, and us. It was the first gathering since Thanksgiving. When we arrived, I expected the usual: help in the kitchen, set the table, step aside when the conversation turned too big. But instead, Ellen looked up from her place at the stove and said, "Mom, will you carve the roast?" I paused. Carl had always carved the roast, but he was already seated at the head of the table, smiling, eyes warm. So I picked up the knife. I carved, I served, I sat. And when someone brought up a news story I'd been following, I joined the conversation, not as a background voice, not with deference, just fully like I belonged there. And no one looked away. Carl watched me the entire time, not possessively, not bitterly, but like he was seeing something he'd missed in his own home for years. Maybe he had. Later that night, as we lay in bed, he reached over and squeezed my hand. It was the first time in years that his touch didn't feel like ownership. It felt like recognition, and I held on, not out of habit, but out of choice. It happened in early spring, just as the crocuses began breaking through the frozen ground and the air carried that faint, hopeful scent of thaw. Ellen had invited us to her home again, this time for a small celebration, her daughter's engagement. There were balloons, catered food, and a new wave of energy in the family. I wore a soft lavender blouse and a smile that didn't feel borrowed anymore. At one point during the party, the conversation turned to marriage advice. Ellen's daughter, glowing with excitement, asked, "What's the secret to a long marriage?" There were chuckles around the room. People glanced at Carl and me, the couple with the longest track record. "Go ahead, Mom," one of the boys said. "Tell them how you've put up with Dad all these years." I smiled, ready to offer something gentle and wise. But Carl tapped his glass with a spoon, just a small clink to signal attention. Then, he reached for his notebook, the one he always carried now. He scribbled slowly, then handed the page to our grandson, who read it aloud. "The secret to a long marriage is marrying someone who doesn't need the spotlight to shine." There was a pause, a few polite laughs, but my stomach turned. It sounded sweet, on the surface. But beneath it, I heard the old music playing again, that subtle reinforcement of silence as virtue. The applause for the woman who stays quiet, who supports, who remains soft-edged and invisible. And something inside me pushed back. I used to believe that, I said aloud. The room quieted. But that's not the whole truth. The secret to a long marriage isn't silence. It's patience, forgiveness, and sometimes sacrifice. But it should never be about disappearing so someone else can stand taller. Ellen raised an eyebrow. One of her brothers looked away. Carl stared at me. I didn't blink. I gave up a lot of years believing that my voice wasn't needed, I continued. That being a good wife meant staying in the background. But I see now, love should never ask you to erase yourself. There was no anger in my voice, only clarity. Carl looked down at his lap, his fingers trembling slightly. Then he wrote again, slower this time. I didn't know I was asking you to disappear. I looked at the page, then back at him. I think that's the problem, Carl, I said gently. You never asked. You just filled the space. A hush settled over the room. I stood. I'm going to help in the kitchen, I said, not to escape, but to give the moment room to breathe. As I walked away, I heard one of our grandchildren whisper, Grandma's kind of amazing. And for the first time, I believed it, not because anyone else said it, but because I had finally said it to myself. We didn't speak much the night after the engagement party. Not because we were angry, but because some truths don't settle quickly. They hover. They stir. They wait. Carl sat in his chair by the EBR fireplace, pen in hand, notebook open, but blank. I folded laundry nearby, the rhythmic motion of cloth and cotton helping me think. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was thoughtful. Finally, he wrote something down and slid the notebook across the coffee table. I didn't see what I was doing to you. I thought I was leading. I thought I was protecting myself. I read the words slowly, then looked at him. I know you did, I said. But leadership without listening, it's not protection, it's a wall. He looked at me with eyes filled not with pride, but with age, with understanding. Maybe for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what to say next. He was hearing what had already been said. I don't resent you, I continued, but I do wish you had seen me, not as someone beneath you or behind you, but beside you. He nodded slowly. Then he wrote again. I'm still here. I want to see you now. That sentence did something to me. It didn't fix everything, but it reached something soft that had hardened over time. Because acknowledgement, even late, is still a kind of grace. I sat down beside him and took his hand. I'm not the same woman I was when we married, I said, and that's a good thing. He looked at me, a glimmer of something proud flickering behind his tired expression. I still love you, I said. But I love myself now too. And in that moment I realized I didn't need him to speak to feel heard anymore, because I had found my own voice, and it no longer asked for permission. Spring turned to summer, and our house filled with a different kind of quiet, not the silence of control, but the stillness of mutual respect. Carl spoke less, not only because of his stroke, but because now he didn't need to fill the space to feel present. And I, for the first time in decades, filled the silence naturally. I joined a book club at the local library, hosted a garden tea for some women from church. Ellen helped me set up an old Facebook account, and I reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in years. The world widened, not with noise, but with choice. Carl adjusted. He watched me bloom like someone watching a flower they'd planted years ago, not realizing how deep the roots had run. One afternoon, while we were sorting through old photo albums, he tapped a picture of us from our early years. Me in a pale blue dress, laughing, turned halfway away from the camera. He pointed to it, then to me, then wrote one line on his pad. "She's back." I smiled. "No," I said softly. "She finally arrived." There was no need for more. That summer, during a small family cookout, our youngest grandchild asked me what I had wanted to be when I was little. "A teacher," I said, "or a writer." "Are you going to be one now?" she asked, eyes wide. I looked over at Carl, who nodded as if to say, "Why not?" And I realized I already was. Maybe not in the title, but in presence, in voice. I'm finally telling my story. Because the truth is, I hadn't waited all those years for Carl to stop speaking. I'd waited for myself to start. When I think back on all the years I spent silent, I don't feel regret, not in the way people expect. I feel something deeper, a kind of reverence for the woman I was, holding everything inside, believing she was doing right by her family. She wasn't weak, she was waiting. And when the time came, when the silence in our house shifted from habit to necessity, I didn't rise in anger. I rose in truth. I didn't need to rewrite the past. I only needed to claim my place in the I. Present, Carl's silence became my opening. And in that space, I remembered how to speak. What surprised me most wasn't that others listened, but that I did. I listened to my own words. I trusted them. I stood behind them. That's a kind of power no one can give you. It has to be earned, over time, through hurt, through clarity, through grace. I still love Carl. I always will, but I love him differently now. Not as someone to follow, but as someone who now sits beside me, equal in presence, if not in speech. And when our children gather at the table, they no longer look to just one end for the voice that sets the tone. They look at both of us, or, sometimes, they look at me. And when they do, I don't nod quietly anymore. I speak. There are many kinds of silence in a woman's life. There's the silence we inherit from our mothers, grandmothers, the generations before us who were told that strength looked like quiet, like endurance, like swallowing your opinions before they reached your tongue. There's the silence we choose, for peace, for survival, for love. And then there's the silence we outgrow. I think that's the most powerful one of all, because it takes courage to unlearn something that once felt like virtue. It takes bravery to admit, even to yourself, that you want to be heard, not in anger, not in desperation, but with steadiness and grace. Carl never asked me to be small, but he never invited me to be large either. And so I remained quiet, dutiful, grateful, even for being beside a man the world respected, until one day that world changed. His voice fell silent, and I realized mine was still waiting. Not bitter, not resentful, just ready. Now, I speak at family dinners. I lead the prayer when it's asked of me. I tell stories that make the grandchildren laugh and lean in. And when Carl looks at me, he doesn't interrupt. He smiles, nods, and holds my hand. There is peace between us now, not because the past was erased, but because the truth finally filled the space between us. I'm not angry for the years I was silent, because that silence taught me exactly what my voice is worth. And now that I've found it again, I won't lay it down, not for tradition, not for comfort, not even for love. Because real love, true, lasting, holy love, knows how to make room for two voices at the same table. And I've earned mine. If this story reminded you of your own voice, the one you silenced for peace, for partnership, or for fear, take this as your sign to begin. Again, your words matter. Your story matters. And if you believe in stories like this, stories of quiet strength and long overdue truth, we invite you to follow this channel. Share it with someone who needs reminding. It's never too late to be heard. Because the most powerful sound in the world is a woman who speaks after years of silence. And the most powerful moment is when the room listens.